warm welcome to everybody. My name is Christian Fischer. I'm here at DIIS, and it's great to see you. And also, of course, welcome to all the good people who are following the streaming we are having here. While I here we go. No problem. We do not have a full auditorium today, but I can say with a lot of certainty that we have lots of smart people here today, because we have a very interesting setting here with three eminent speakers, and we have a very important topic ahead of us. And of course, the elections in Italy are very important to the Italians, but they're certainly also very important to the Europeans and to the Danes. So I think that it's very good to have you here, and I think it's very interesting to see what comes out of the elections. I'm very much looking forward to see. And I was about to write a new government, but then I changed my manuscript and said that the next government, because you can't take for granted anything in Italian politics. But I'm very much looking forward to see what is happening when it comes to keeping Italy together. Of course, on what is going to happen with the next government's EU policies, economic policies, issues like tax and pension reforms. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what is going to be the next government's position on relations to Russia, and of course also to Ukraine. Migration is an obvious issue also in Italian politics, and other issues like climate change. So there's a lot of very interesting topics that we're all looking forward to see what is going to be the forthcoming government's policies. And therefore, of course, I've been looking very much forward to this event with you, three eminent people here. And the best way to move forward quickly is to introduce you, not waste any more time, and say that we will have a session here today where we will give each of you 15 minutes. And then there'll be a little bit of a forth and backwards between you after that. And then we'll have an interactive session. This is something we like to do. We like to have a dialogue between the people who show up here. So we'll have ample time to have time for comments and questions and so forth. That's very important. And in order to steer this, I have, in the best Italian football way, taken the liberty to bring along a red card, a yellow card. So you have 15 minutes each, and when you've used 13 of those minutes, I will use the yellow card, and when you have used 15 minutes, I'll use the red card. And that means finish the sentence, please. But I will not get to that. Let me introduce you. We have, of course, Fabrizio Tassinari, who for many years worked here at DIIS as a senior researcher. It's great to have you back, Fabrizio. You're not working as a executive director at the, can I still say new school, 4 years old, the School of Transitional Governance at the European University Institute in Florence. I have visited it myself, and I know that the academic standards are very high and the settings are also very high. And you have recently published a new book. I hope that you will also use some of the insights in that in your intervention here. And we look very much forward to that. Welcome back to DIIS. After Fabrizio, we will have Professor Marlene Wind, who is a director for the European politics, for Center of the European Politics at the Department of Political Science at the Copenhagen University. You have so many other titles, Marlene. I checked your CV. You have so many other titles and affiliations that I said, and you're so well known to everybody, by the way. So I said, I will not go into a long presentation of you. I'll come with two things. One is that I think that you are very active on dissemination of your research, and we are very many people who are really happy about that you are so active about it. And secondly, a fun fact: we used to be on the DIIS board together many years ago, so you also had DIIS affiliation. Welcome to you. Welcome back to you. And lastly, but not least, we have Alberte Bové-Rud, who will make a presentation on political parties in the Italian election. Alberte is doing her PhD here at DIIS, and her area of expertise is on perceptions and challenges of democracy, specifically focusing on Italy. And I'm sure you will not run out of issues to study in the years to come with that field of expertise. You may also be well known to some of the people here because you've been very active in your dissemination, written on TV and so forth. So it's good to have you also here, and you will have the last presentation, but not the least. Okay. So far about the presentations. Fabrizio, will you lead us off, please?
Yes. All right. Thanks, Christian, and good morning to you all. It is really, it is not platitude that it is a pleasure to be back. In many ways, this is my home, but also not only metaphorically, but literally. I was telling Malene and Alberta before that the Italian state still sends the ballot for voting here. So that's one of the reasons I came to actually vote in the election in Italy. The second maybe caveat or preface before saying a few things is that indeed I wrote this book, which is not about Italy actually. But this is perhaps the only time and place where I can use the book to speak about Italy. Time because we are in Denmark, and you probably this is pretty much about what I have learned and observed as a foreigner working and living in Northern Europe. So the premise is probably known to most of you, but then I can now use it to actually talk about Italy. Probably I will not be able to do this any other time. And I think I'll stick to my time. I should just say, Christian, that the red and yellow thing in Italy, you know, the traffic light is a suggestion, is not so, or an opinion even. But I will stick with the time. I will divide my remarks on 3 points, which I actually follow quite neatly from what the book does. One on the first on the adversarial nature of Italian politics. I would say peculiarly adversarial at that. The second one, where I will dedicate a little more time, is on the autonomy of the bureaucracy or lack thereof. And I'm really happy that Lars came here because we wrote about this together from a north-south perspective back in the day. And the third point is, in lack of a better word, on what I would call intermediate bodies in the body politic of Italy: media, business, civil society. Again, we call this transnational governance in Florence, but let's call them intermediate bodies for the sake of discussing domestic politics here in Italy. I'm not an expert in Italian politics. I think no one is. I mean, the other day I remembered a quote from Madeleine Albright, who said that to understand Europe you need to be a genius or French. And I sort of paraphrased that: to understand Italian politics you need to be a genius or mad, because there's no way to predict sometimes. Now, on the adversarial nature of Italian politics. Now, there's nothing wrong about adversarial politics. In fact, it's in the nature of democratic politics, and we have it here. We have it in increasingly polarized way in the United States. Again, there's nothing particularly unique about Italy in that regard. If it isn't that over the past 3 decades, really, which is since when the so-called First Republic, dominated by the Christian Democrats, and the power system around that collapsed, it gave way to a very fragmented political scene. Dominated, yes, partly by Berlusconi, in specific segments by the center left, but really what was the defining feature of this period, which is by now quite long, is fragmentation. Confirmed not least by the fact that the electoral law has been changed 4 times in this period, and that's what Parliament always talks about whenever it reconvenes. Let's change the electoral law. It gives you a sense that there is a lot of inherent instability in the way the electoral system is built. And one of the outcomes of that is that policy making as a result, and the reform process, what you were referring, Christian, about anything from taxes to pensions to justice reform, is extremely, there is not continuity to it. Every government in power has a tendency to somehow wipe off what the previous government did and start anew. A couple of examples. One of the main reforms that Mario Monti, not Draghi, we'll talk about Draghi later, but Mario Monti did when he was in power in 2012 was pension reform. And every single government that has come since then wanted to wipe off that pension reform, which was passed because Italy was on the brink of default, not because they wanted to do it. Same with labor market reform. I talk a little bit about that actually in the book, because this was something that Matteo Renzi put at the center of his government almost a decade ago now. But that also, ever since he has left power, they have tried to wipe it off. And what I'm trying to say is that and this again, whether or not Danish and Nordic politics has changed since, I've written the book, or in any case in the past few years, you can say that whether or not you call it consensus, there is a general understanding that some of these reforms take time to simply produce effects. So the very idea that you have to campaign on wiping off the record of your predecessor is problematic. If you ask me, it goes back to a, superficially but still very strongly ideologized way of politicking, and you see this in the campaign. The left is still, in Berlusconi's parlance, the heir of the communists, and of course there is a strong, radical left component there, but that's not what it is about. Even more this time around, there is the ideological element on the right, with Meloni being labeled, perhaps with good reason, you will talk about this, as neo-fascist. But this way of building up the political debate doesn't help the governance in a practical sense. When it comes to the specific of this election campaign, I would point out 2 key issues which I think will be at the center of whatever happens afterwards. The first is next generation EU. And this has been probably the signature, we cannot even call it a reform, but the signature package of measures that the Draghi government implemented when it came to power. You could almost say Draghi was nominated in order to get a proper package for this. And one of the things that Meloni has been saying, Giorgia Meloni from, Fratelli d'Italia, likely to be the first party in the election, has been to renegotiate the package, Next Generation EU, which, even if you are not an economist, which I'm not, it sounds a little bit ironic considering that Italy is the biggest beneficiary of this package. So what do you want to renegotiate? You're already getting the most of it. But her point is, and to be fair, this is the kind of things that if you have if you, as an electorate, you have an ear for Euroscepticism, you will be easily charmed by this. When she says, for example, yes, we are receiving 200+ billion from the EU, but more than half of this is actually loans. And so we are really getting not 200. This, she said it actually last week, and I thought it was interesting. We were not actually getting 200. We're getting 60 billion from the EU. But in the same time span, we are giving the EU 30 billion. So we are actually only getting 30 billion. And is that really a big deal? So you see, if you have a year for Eurosceptic, there is something to that narrative. So I don't think in the end of the day she will probably make some tweaks, and I think again she's been very smart in repositioning herself as it becomes more probable that she will have a role in government. One of the things she's saying, for example, is that, well, you know, the contracts and the tenders that were designed in the Next Generation EU package were done before inflation was at the level that is now. So nobody is going to apply for those contracts because they are not very profitable anymore. So she's very detailed, which makes her certainly not your typical populist in that respect. And I guess you might have some comments about that as well. The second point where I feel increasingly conflicted about how the adversarial nature will affect the actual policies is, of course, on Russia and Ukraine. I will come back to this later, especially about the role of intermediate bodies, not least energy companies and medias, the way they have affected this discussion in Italy. But when it comes to the policy itself, it is no secret and quite unashamedly so, that both the junior partners of Berlusconi's coalition, Berlusconi and Salvini, have been outrageously pro-Russia, pro-Putin until a few months ago. They have corrected their stance ever since for reasons of political convenience. It was untenable to remain pro-Russian after the invasion, but you see increasingly signs that they are actually backtracking. I don't know if any of you had a chance to see, it's probably too early, but yesterday night Berlusconi made a whole reconstruction of how the war came about, essentially arguing that Putin was pushed by people within his entourage, which, you know, if it is a measure of things to come, it is concerning. To close on this first part of the adversarial nature, paradoxically, on this point of Russia, you will probably be better off as Italy and as Europe if Meloni is very strong in the coalition. A strong Meloni, which has so far at least been quite consistent on condemning Russia, supporting sanctions, supporting military support for Ukraine. If you have a strong Meloni and a bad or a weak junior partners, which is what it looks like at the moment, then maybe the effect of that disagreement will be less strong. So this for the adversarial nature. I think it's not new. It is in the nature of how Italian politics is built. Will they even last long enough? Then many commentators arguing, well, in 6 months they will disagree. You will have Draghi again. I would personally, as a citizen, actually not mind that, but I doubt it. The center right has proven to be very disciplined when in power, for whatever means they use to stay in power. And I actually had last week dinner with accidentally with Romano Prodi, who was the only one who beat the right technically at the elections twice, Berlusconi. And he said, but of course, don't take my word for it, but he said power is a glue. When they get in power, they will stick together. So that's for the first part. For the second part, and I will be quicker about these, is on the issue of bureaucratic autonomy in policy making. Now, you get time and again in Italy these star technocrats that are called in when politics gets in trouble, which is admittedly rather often. And this has been the story of Draghi, Monti before that, Carla Zaleo Ciampi before that. That is a sign, of course, of the, what democracy studies would call output legitimacy. I mean, they are brought there because they bring expertise. But of course, in Italy, the problem, if any, is of input legitimacy. I mean, clearly the parties that are supposed to represent the electorate are not able to actually deliver and to form a government. That remains problematic all the more, and this is, for me, one of the key differences when I have lived here, worked at DIIS, been very close in contact with the foreign ministry and the defense ministry. Here, the civil servants play a key role in defining policy making. I'm not going to say to what extent and in which way then the politicians abide to those. I do have an anecdote in the book about this book, this other book that came out in Denmark a few years ago called, I don't know if you remember this, called Mørkelygten. It was about all the episodes in which the civil servants, and the reason I mention it in my book is that if any Italian read that book, they would say, what's the problem? I mean, if civil servants do what the politicians tell them to do, what's the problem? That's what they're supposed to do. But that's not the case in a strong bureaucracy and state. I think this remains a problem in Italy. And it will be the case that top civil servants will be changed when the new governments come into power. Clearly, Draghi put in the key positions technocrats like him. It's not accidental that the Minister of Climate Transition and the Minister of Digital Transition were two technocrats, because they were the key, the biggest pots of next generation EU. He gave them to technocrats. But this will not last long, I'm afraid, no matter who wins. The third point, which I will only introduce because it's probably the most fascinating, and I suspect there will be questions, the role of intermediate bodies, business or especially media. Every country has its own story here, but in Italy it's fair to say that they have played an undue and often extremely politicized role in political life. In the 60s and the 70s, Fiat would determine industrial policy in Italy. In the 90s, Mediaset would determine media politics in Italy. And I'm afraid you have a situation now, and we can discuss that, whether the large energy, state-owned as well, energy company, Eni, has been determining foreign policy in Italy, and to what extent in relation to Russia. The result of this has been a very, at times very surreal public debate on some key issues of policy. And the media discussion on Ukraine and Russia has been and continues to be very surreal. You can wonder the motives, the reasons why it is so, but it is probably, and I've written a couple of times, mostly out of outrage than anything else, why you would invite Zakharova or Soloviev on national Italian TV to simply give speeches is beyond me, and it is something that continues to happen unless you really go into the international media to protest about this. They just continue to do it, and if it is part of a bigger, I wouldn't even call it conspiracy, but if there is a strong pro-Russia lobby in Italy or not, I'm sure it will eventually have to be investigated in the proper ways. Yes, I'm actually, you have probably seen that Secretary Blinken from the US came out saying that Italy is among the countries where Russia has been paying certain political parties. I think there will have to be, after the election, an investigation in Parliament for this. Open and close the parentheses because I've seen the red flag. In Italy, these inquiries are not independent. In Denmark, you would have DIIS doing that inquiry. Actually, you would have DIIS doing an inquiry about that, maybe, but in Italy, it is actually it's a parliamentary inquiry. So it's the judges judging themselves, or what you say, the arbiters are arbitrating themselves. It's a little bit controversial. Bottom line, I'm not too optimistic. Some of the trends are long term. It's nothing new, but clearly the right wing turn is unusual, and this is not going to be a center right as much as a conservative nationalist right wing turn in Italy. How long it will last, we will probably be more clever about this on Monday. But as much as I would like to, I'm not too optimistic. So I stop there.
All right. Thank you very much, Fabrizio, for this, and thank you, DIIS, for inviting me and for hosting this debate. I think it certainly is very, very pertinent and important, and that we should also in Denmark discuss Italy. And it's not that we don't do it, but it's almost like when something peculiar happens or something with football, then we discuss Italy, and otherwise we don't really pay that much attention. I would say I really think that having you on board as one of those who comment on Italian politics is important. I was given this role of both commenting on your book. And you didn't say anything about your book, very little. Well, I don't know. But then also say something about how I see the election on Sunday playing into at the European scene, and I'll try to bridge those two somehow. First, saying a little bit about the context, the book itself, and so on, and then move to look at some of those elements in the policies that we know so far that may, be problematic for the European Union. So first of all, I want to really seriously commend you on the book. I think, as you can see, I read it very thoroughly. It was hard for me to get it from my sons because they both simply grabbed it. I have a son who's 20 and one who's 18, and they read it before me. Wow. Yeah, it was interesting that they really enjoyed it. What I really like about it, first of all, of course I'm going to say something critical as well, but let me start, as you always do, with the niceties, and I think they are certainly in the majority. I really like the way you write. It's brilliantly written. It's almost like prose, and I think you have also been commended for that by a lot of reviewers. So it was definitely a big pleasure to read. For those of you who have not read it, I think that one of the things that really struck me and also made me much wiser was this take you have on looking at the two extremes of governance. Like you compare Singapore to Sacramento, that's the first chapter, where you sort of see the Nordic countries in the middle of that. So you have the extreme control in Singapore, and you have, of course, this is ideal types, and you have the complete opposite in the United States, and you could even have taken a much worse place. You could have taken, where everybody has a gun in his pocket, right? I was in Miami in May, and I was walking into a bar, and people were sitting with guns in their pockets, their back pockets, drinking beer. So you have the extreme freedom, and then you have the freedom in the sense of no regulation, and then you have the control. I don't know where Italy comes into this. We could maybe get back to that. But I think that is very, very interesting to have this discussion in your book about whether the middle way really is the Nordic countries, and what can we learn from that type of mixing control and very, very detailed governance with some sense of liberty. That I certainly think you got that right. So you have this kind of an all-embracing state from cradle to grave in the Nordic countries, and then maybe the more chaotic Italian way of life. I lived in Italy myself for 5 years almost. And that was Berlusconi. So it's a long time ago, but now he's back. So it's interesting to see. Yes, because he looks young. He had so much plastic surgery. So it's very hard to distinguish him from the 19th when I was living in Italy. But what I would like to also say is that, or sort of a little bit be the devil's advocate in terms of saying, okay, so you are describing what's happening in Italy as adversarial, as very extreme, and I don't know if Alberti will agree with that. But you could also argue that Italy is just mainstreaming the right, as we have been doing in Denmark since 2001. Mainstreaming, the radical policies that you would never dream of being proposed by a Danish government. And now you also see, in Sweden, the Swedish Democrats. I think a lot of the policies that the current social democratic government, we have just become, all right, just another day in the office. And then there's another suggestion for exporting immigrants. I mean, it's not even shocking us anymore. You have central liberal newspapers that sort of say, well, we have to do this is important. Also the conservative liberals in the Danish parliament who are currently expecting to maybe take over in a short while, they sort of play it down, but in reality they will take over the exact same right-wing policies when it comes to migration that we see in Italy. I think probably if it was Meloni who had put forward exporting immigrants to Rwanda, I think we would have been totally shocked. So in a sense, I would like to ask you about that. Yes. Is it not just mainstreaming the extreme right that we will be seeing in Italy in the next government? Something that we have become used to in this part of the world, and we will probably see it in Sweden as well. So I know it's a bit provocative, but in reality, it could be a movement in that direction. And therefore, I would also really challenge your point about the middle way, that it really is the middle way. I think we have moved much more to the right than we even realize ourselves. And another thing that I was lacking in your book, and now I'm not an expert on Italian politics, please take note of that. I'm focusing on the EU. I've been working for the past 7 years on democratic backsliding. So I am in the nitty-gritty details of what backsliding actually is in a democracy. So that's also my project that I'm working on right now to hope to get funded. That's about how do democracies backslide? How do you use the law to actually undermine democracy itself from within? And there, first of all, I think we see some big differences between Hungary and Italy. So I don't buy into the point that we will, or to the argument that some people have. Not you don't discuss that in the book, but that some people have that we will have a new Orban in Italy. I don't believe that. I think Italy. You can't rule Italy in the way he is ruling Hungary. It's not possible. You simply won't take it. But let me just stop with or just say a few words about the Nordics again before going to the Italian case. I think that what you were lacking, I was saying there was something missing in the book that I think would have been interesting, and that is the fact that the Nordic countries were actually only place, except from the UK after the Second World War, that did not have or introduce constitutional democracy. We have unlimited parliaments. You may say we have good civil servants. We certainly have. We have prided ourselves of that also where I teach and so on. But it's still quite interesting that when I talk to American colleagues, they are completely shocked when I tell them that there's no judicial review in Denmark. You don't have that in Finland and in Sweden and in Denmark. In Finland and Sweden, it was simply put into the constitution that you could not overrule the parliament. In Denmark, it was not mentioned. We do have division of powers, but we don't have balancing of powers. So when you want to take Inger Støjberg, radical, politicians, ministers to court, you have to have a majority to do it. So everything is about the majority. Is there a majority? And if the majority moves right, then you have no breaks anymore. And that was something that I really was kind of looking for in your book, to have a discussion of what does it mean. It may work nicely when you have a consensus society where everything works wonderfully and where everybody agrees what's right, what's wrong, and so on. But when you move into a situation where you are actually putting policies out there that are challenging European law, challenging conventions, you have politicians saying like Nick Hækkerup, our former justice minister, well, control is freedom. Control is freedom. And logging rules by the EU is an offense to Denmark and the Danish politicians who want to go in another direction, and we want to go to the limits of the conventions. I mean, when you have that new style of politicians, I think there is a danger that our type of democracy, which you could call majoritarian democracy, you have this distinction between majoritarian and constitutional democracy, where majoritarian democracies are actually in danger of also backsliding themselves. And it's quite interesting that when I've studied the peculiarities in Hungary and Poland about backsliding, I very often hear very high-profile lawyers saying, well, Denmark, they have an unlimited parliament. They can do whatever they want because the judges don't do anything, It happened only once in Denmark, since we got our constitution in 1849, that the Supreme Court set aside anything happening decided in the parliament. So once. In Sweden and Finland, it's also very rare. Even though they did reform their constitutions, it's still quite rare. I think that Finland is probably the country that has moved most in the constitutional direction. So we know it from the UK as well, sovereignty in parliament and all that. So I just want to say that I think even though I really, really enjoyed reading your book, I think there's so much in there. It also made me think a lot about it. My oldest son, he was so proud, he's so much into history and he loves Rome. So he said, well, in Rome they had sewage systems and they were much more advanced than us. We were living in caves, Why is that not in the book? And what happened? What happened? So I think it's really an important contribution, and I really hope it will also be debated widely in the years to come, because there are some important insights. Going back to Italy and Europe, and what actually, and I'll do this quick because I know I'll probably get a sign very, very soon, but I'm wondering, since we are talking about mainstreaming, or I am at least suggesting that we may be moving in that direction with Meloni, more than a turn to the extreme right. I agree with you that if she is strong on Sunday, that will be better for Europe. And why will that be better for Europe? It will be better for our policy towards Russia. I think she has been standing firm. She supported Draghi's policies. She did not once question it, as opposed to Berlusconi and Lega, Salvini. So I think we should trust, or hope at least, that she is, even though there are so many other issues with her policies and her pre-fascist approach to politics and her upbringing, her speeches, the way her rhetoric, it's really appalling, a lot of that. But I think that when you come closer to power, something you also suggested, we will actually see a politician who probably tries at least to comfort everyone that things will be fine. We will not, she doesn't want to leave the euro anymore. She doesn't want to leave the EU. She will renegotiate. Yes, of course, she has to say that. Will that happen? I have my doubts whether it will eventually happen. And then just a final point on. I'm much more nervous about Salvini. He is going down, and I was also a little bit interested in hearing your point, and also you, Alverde, on the way that Meloni has been eating her rivals, right? So it's a little bit like the Danish parliament, where the right-wing Danish People's Party is going down because everyone else has bought into their policies, right? Are we also seeing that in Italy, where Meloni is taking over the votes of Salvini and Berlusconi to some extent, at least? And I know she gets she's up for, I think, 23%, but we have that in Denmark as well on the right wing. So is it really that different in terms of being fascist or being right, extreme right? So that was more, I think, more questions. And then just one point, and then I'll finish, about the rule of law and the difference to Viktor Orban, because a lot of journalists have been comparing. She's in the ECR group in the parliament. She has spoken very nicely about authoritarians like Orban, and so on. And why am I still, nevertheless, hoping and also slightly believing that we cannot compare those two? I think that it's very, very different to be a new democracy coming out of communism, where there's very little access to free media, and then being in Italy, that is a very difficult country to rule, and where people are anarchists, and where you do have some problems with the media landscape. I agree with that, and we see that with people coming in from these terrible Russian commentators who get free access to Italian news outlets and so on. But I still think that it will be very difficult for her to do the same, to use the same technique as you have seen in Hungary. Orban has taken over the courts. He has taken over the media. He has limited freedom of speech, freedom of civil society. I cannot see that. Knowing Italy, I'm not an expert on Italian politics. Again, I want to say that. I want to stress that. But I still have no imagination that what has happened in Poland and Hungary can happen in Italy. I know there's a lot of people talking about LGBT rights. She's saying the same as they are. Sure, absolutely. But that does not necessarily mean that you will limit free abortion. You have a lot of rhetoric out there. You have a lot of, like Vox in Spain, but believing that she will actually be able to legislate in the same way as Orban has done, and what we also see in Poland. I don't believe that. I simply don't believe that. I think the Italian women, those I know, will take to the streets. They will never let this happen. So I think there is a big difference there. It's a different type of right-wing regime. Where I'm nervous is certainly how she will act in the council. That she might use her power because Italy is a big country. So she may use her power to make it very hard to hit, to reform. Also, if the treaties are changed or need to be changed, if we want to hit, autocrats in Central and Eastern Europe, she might, put conditions and make it very hard for the EU to do anything. I think she's going to play her cards very well. I think she's probably quite bright. That's also what we can see from her detailed knowledge of what she wants. Yes. So I think for Europe, it's certainly not good. I agree with your skepticism, but I would also say it's not Hungary.
Yeah. And I'll dive further into the current Italian political situation with the upcoming election. Now we've spoken about frameworks and democratic optimism and pessimism, perhaps. And I'll make a short presentation about this particular right wing that we've spoken about now, about who they actually are, and about these power dynamics within the right wing coalition, which are very, in my opinion at least, determining how things will look after the election as well. So a quick overview of these three parties that are worth mentioning. This right-wing coalition is Forza Italia with Berlusconi, that we have come to know for the past 30 years as a defining figure in Italian politics. He now is the leader of the smallest party, as it looks right now in the opinion polls, and is the leader of the party that is furthest to the center of this right-wing coalition, which perhaps also, speaking about the mainstreaming of the right, is very a clear sign of the spectacle of this right-wing coalition. Then we have Lega, that is led by Matteo Salvini, who most of us also got to know a few years ago when he was the Interior Minister of Italy, and quite scandalously kept ships from entering Italian harbors, ships with migrants and refugees on them, and eventually was actually put on trial for that on Sicily. A very scandalous figure who up until recently had a quite realistic idea of him becoming prime minister after the next Italian election. That nevertheless changed within the past 2 years. The power dynamic shifted. So now in opinion polls, we have the most recent poll for about a week ago, and it's been like that for the past year or so. He is between 10-15% in opinion polls. And then lastly, we have Meloni, who, with saying that we can't predict Italian politics, I will go as close as I can and say that a miracle must happen if she's not the prime minister in the next government, because as it looks now, she won't just be the leader of the biggest party, Fratelli d'Italia. Her party seems to be up around almost 25% in some of the polls. But she's also going to be the leader of this coalition, and by far the biggest party in this coalition. And now I've mentioned them in this particular order: Forza Italia with Berlusconi, then Salvini with Lega, and then Meloni with Fratelli d'Italia. And this illustrates not only how big the parties are, that Meloni's is the biggest and Berlusconi is the smallest, but also the fact that I touched upon previously, that Berlusconi somehow has now become the centrist figure of this coalition, and Meloni is the most right-wing. So here is the novelty, that all of a sudden the power within this right-wing coalition lies here furthest at the right. But the coalition in itself is not new. In fact, this particular coalition, not with these particular politicians, Berlusconi, yes, but not the others, but this particular coalition with these three parties has been in government several times before. And when Berlusconi first entered into politics in the middle of the 90s, it was with this exact coalition. back then the power dynamics were completely different than now, but in a way he was the one mainstreaming not just Lega, who is in many regards a quite controversial party, but specifically Fratelli d'Italia, which was then called Alleanza Nazionale. And already back then we were discussing in people, I wasn't, but Italians were discussing whether it was democratically legitimate and democratically unproblematic to have people such as those from the Alleanza Nazionale in government. So the novelty is Meloni, is the fact that Meloni is so widely popular. The novelty in itself is not that the right is so strong. When we add the opinion polls up, it is around 45% of the votes. That's not a landslide victory, but eventually it probably will be, which is why I go as far as claiming Meloni to be the victor of this election even before it's been held, because Italian electoral laws, and there are quite a few, and I'm not able to describe all of them, but this one of these particularities with the Italian election system is that 33% of the mandates are distributed in a way that resembles the British way to do it, so the first past the post. This means that because the right wing actually has a coalition and has decided to play strategically, positioning themselves in a strategic way within or prior to the election, this like 33% of the mandates, they won't take votes from each other. So this also in a way highlights how the current popularity of the right also has to do with the lack of coalition on the left. In a way, if you just look at the opinion polls, it's about 45% that will vote for something center-right or right-wing, and it's about 45% that will vote for the other parties. So if they had managed to overcome their ideological differences and go against Meloni and the right, things would look differently. But they didn't. So we're in a situation now where the question is not whether Meloni will be prime minister, but the question is how many mandates will she get, and how will the power dynamics of this structure look? Because within the past 30 years, power has shifted. Power was once with Berlusconi, then it was for a shorter period with Salvini, and now it's with Meloni. And many things could be mentioned about Berlusconi and Salvini, but one thing is surely that they have difficulties with accepting a role as a junior associate, as a role as a supporting member of the government. And that will surely be interesting to see how that plays out. So looking at the election results when we get them, perhaps Monday or even late Sunday, is to see not just how big is this coalition's win, but also how big is Meloni? Because if Meloni is by far the biggest, not just of the three, because she will be, but if she's also bigger than Salvini and Berlusconi's parties collectively, then that will change power dynamics surely within this coalition. Just yesterday, perhaps it was the day prior, they were discussing openly how to distribute ministers among them. And Matteo Salvini has the idea that he's going to be very influential in that distribution, perhaps also to the disbelief of the EU. It's very interesting who's going to be, for instance, Minister of Finance. And Meloni, if she gets this very big landslide victory, she won't allow that. And she's already said that that's not necessarily how it's going to play out. So we're in a very peculiar situation now also with what that you touched upon. We're actually discussing whether Berlusconi, with all his credentials and all of his merits and experience from the EU and his reputation within the EU, whether he's the centrist and the stabilizing factor. He really wants to present himself that way. Towards the rest of the EU especially, or whether it's Meloni, this very far-right figure. Now, we've spoken about it a few times, and in a way I wished I could retain from commenting on it, because this fascist part of her past is, in my opinion, dominating our idea of what she is and what she wants. But nevertheless, it is very important to say that this party of hers, especially in its prior forms, it's a party that has evolved throughout history, has, especially in the past, had fascist tendencies and been nostalgic towards the fascist part. The party was eventually established just after the war by loyalists to Mussolini's regime, and right up till the 90s they were exploring and fascinated with this fascist past. And then since the middle of the 19th, since this first government with Berlusconi, they have tried to distance themselves from this past with some success, but not been entirely convincing, and have not sought to be entirely convincing, because there are still people on the very far margins of the right in Italy who have apologetic or even sympathetic idea of what the nostalgic idea of the fascist regime. And this group of voters, the natural party for them, if they seek at least to vote for a party that will eventually be in parliament, is Fratelli d'Italia, is Meloni's party. So even though she's distancing herself from this past and saying she's not convinced about these fascist tendencies anymore, she still uses symbols and metaphors and refers to this fascist part because she's interested in supporting this group of voters of hers. Then perhaps, and this is a way broader discussion, it also speaks into a general tendency of a lack of how should we put it? The fascist past in Italy hasn't been entirely tabooed in a way familiar with German politics, for instance. So there's still the fascist ideas have been allowed some sort of maneuver, the space of maneuver, even in politics in Italy. So this is not an entirely new idea either. It's not like it's been entirely dead and now it blossoms. No, it hasn't been like that. It's been there all along. So with regards to this question, which is now on top of mind of everybody who is interested in not just Italian politics, but also in EU politics, what is the stability of this government? I think it makes sense to look at it in two time frames. In a short time frame, in the short-term prospect, I very much agree with you that there's simply too many reasons for Meloni to insist on this stabilizing role, that she won't make EU her enemy. As simple as that. She wants the money from the recovery fund, and she also wants to be considered a legitimate leader, because currently in Italy the left wing wants to delegitimize her and to not just become prime minister, but also to stay prime minister. It's of absolute relevance for her that she's considered legitimate. So for starters, initially, I think we should believe her when she says that she will support Ukraine and she wants more Italy in Europe. And she also said the other day that Italy is never going to be the weak link. I think there's good reason to believe her when she says that. But I think, though, that there are two quite big problems, and that's Berlusconi and Salvini, because their reputation in the EU is quite different than what she wants to depict to be Italy's future, and they're, in my views, quite unpredictable. Their ambition to be powerful has also previously taken Salvini out of government, for instance. So even though that the Romano Prodi, among others, say that they want power, so they'll stick together, I'm not necessarily sure that they understand or that they are willing to accept just being backseated for 5 years. And I'm not necessarily convinced that Meloni will accept their big egos to fill up the political agenda. And then for the longer term, I also think that Meloni will have difficulties with keeping the same amount of popularities that she has currently if she does not actually deliver on some of her so-called identity values. She voted against, I recalled, the recovery fund, Draghi's plan of the recovery fund, and that's very problematic if she will just simply accept it from now on, at least to her electorate. Yeah, and what was with the backsliding of democracy, that made me think of what actually is their kind of democracy. Just recently, Salvini and Meloni was criticizing the EU for their condemnation of Orban, because their idea of democracy eventually is quite populist, that the people is always right. So it's all about the votes. That's what it's all about. And this is also why it's going to be very interesting to see how big their win will be, because if it gets close to 2/3, they can actually change the constitution without referenda. And a specific idea they have is to change the role of the presidency in Italy to in favor of presidentialism, which is obviously something that is heavily criticized by the center left as a democratic backsliding tendency. But in their opinion, it's just a way of actually enforcing democracy, making it look more similar to the French presidentialism. So it's very... I'm not sure that they're necessarily dangerous to democracy, but I am sure that they're not necessarily agreeing on the current structure of democracy in Italy. Yeah, I think that was it.
Thank you, Alberte, and thank you also for starting the conversation already. We now move into the Q&A session, but before we do that, and let me say, when we do that, please, when you have the microphone, you need to have the microphone, because we also want to speak to the people who follow us on the live stream. When you have the microphone, please state your name and if you have an institutional affiliation, please. But before we do that, Malene, you asked Fabrizio 2 questions.
You remember?
Yes, I remember. I even wrote them down. One was on the mainstreaming of the right wing, and the other one was on the democratic backsliding. Do you make quick remarks so we have time for the Q&A?
Yeah. No, thanks for that, because then we can open up for other questions. But I actually wanted to respond to that. Thanks so much to both of you. Very interesting. On the mainstreaming, I'm completely with you, and if I can use a pun that is actually also in the book, when we speak about the Nordics as foregangsland, in the book I say maybe they have been the foregangsland also in this mainstreaming of the right.
Good point.
And certainly that is the case in Italy as well. We could certainly see that. I agree with you. One thing that concerns me, and that was perhaps not the case as much with Salvini, and certainly not with Berlusconi, but it is with Meloni, is this about mainstreaming of far-right values, but also when it comes to civil rights and civil liberties. I mean, you could say it was a lot about immigration, it was a lot about Italy first, Italian first, but all this about civil rights, abortion rights, LGBT rights. It is again, as a citizen, disturbing to hear, and I do wonder to what extent I mean, as a citizen, I would actually hope that your conclusion is correct. Italians will rebel eventually against that, but that is what is different. And if that is going to be part of the mainstreaming operation, it is disturbing. So that's one observation on the democratic backsliding, but also actually on your point on constitutional democracy and judicial review. It's a very well taken point. I actually take it at heart. I may even consider to write a little bit about it. You are the law and politics dean in that regard. So clearly, you have a point there. One observation I have, and this is in fact where the Italian case is relevant, is that the First Republic, Italy's First Republic, was effectively brought down by the judiciary. Okay, it was the Milan pool and it was on corruption charges. But what you have seen ever since then, and this is where Berlusconi has been so toxic, has been in effectively arguing that the judiciary has become politicized since then. And of course, Italy is an extreme case, but you see the same in the United States. And there, of course, you are the expert in this. I'm not going to claim I know every case, but I do wonder whether the combination of mainstreaming of populism and of right-wing populism with judicial review might not lead to a politicization of the judiciary, where they take a political role. And that is concerning. One last point, and then on the neo-fascist point of Meloni. I am also concerned, and here I'm going to be a sort of pop anthropologist or pop psychologist, but Meloni has been, as you say, very adamant to reposition herself. So she went out. You can actually look it up on YouTube. She did a little clip in 3 different languages to say that she condemns Mussolini. She condemns the anti-Semitic laws of 1938. Perfect. I mean, photogenic, good. But she does not take issue and she does not take a position on the neo-fascist movements that still exist in Italy. And there's where this pop psychology comes in, because these movements, they hark back to Mussolini, but they have been around and they are around in football stadiums. Hooligans, they are effectively right-wing movements. And so my concern and my real worry as a citizen is that whether or not Meloni denounces them, which she has not done, they will feel disenfranchised. They will feel vindicated. And so there could be intolerance. There could be street violence. I don't know. But that's what I'm concerned about. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And thanks again for an excellent introduction here. Now it's time for the Q&A. Let me say that you don't have to be above 50 to ask a question. You don't need to have a PhD degree to ask questions. We very much welcome also the younger people to ask questions. You don't need to make comments and so forth. Yep. Oh, fantastic.
Hi. Is it on? Yeah. I will start the question from the younger side.
Yes.
I'm Francesco Campo. I'm working for Roskilde University here in Denmark, a PhD as well on populist parties. Thank you for the presentation. I have a lot of thoughts to wrap my head around still. So I will start with just one question, and this is about this idea that Italians will eventually rebel whether the right arrive to touch certain civic rights, etc. My question is whether civic society in Italy actually matters. We have seen mobilization against the right wing in the past 30 years. We can start from the Girotondi in the early 2000s to Le Sardine very recently. There have been a variety of mobilization that did not really translate into political action or political parties actually putting even a flag or a hat on that mobilization. And at the same time, we can also see during this electoral campaign, right-wing flirting, at least namely, with certain actors within civil society. Salvini keeps quoting in his statistics CGIL, so one of the trade unions. Meloni had during the electoral campaign this little scene with a member of the LGBT community to show not support, but also not hate necessarily, to reduce the critics towards hate speech. So although eventually maybe we could have movement opposing Meloni, we already see now opposition to that, would that actually, in your opinion, have an expression politically? Would that translate into something? And I have other questions, but I have to formulate them before.
Thank you, Francisco. And since you are, Malene, say you're not an expert on
I
that,
don't want to
so
answer
we'll
that.
put that your side and ask if one of you two would like to.
You can start and then. Yeah.
That's a good question. I think the sardines movement very much encapsulates what you expressed, and also what Malene hopes for, that eventually if this government goes in such a radical way that it will infuriate Italians, they will eventually oppose it in such a dramatic way that it will have its end. I'm perhaps not that optimistic. The sardines movement had an increasing impact, a really big impact on the regional election of Emilia-Romagna. Where are they now? I think it's a general tendency of a lot of these protest movements that, and especially currently on the left and on the center left, that they agree that they despise Meloni and they don't like Salvini and they don't like Berlusconi either. It's an anti-movement. It's defined about what they don't like, and as much as I understand it, the durability of these movements seems to be very difficult to transfer into actually political movements or parties. And for instance, with the sardines, they discussed for weeks whether they should actually support a PD's candidate, because there were such huge differences within this very large group. And I'm also very optimistic that if Meloni actually touches this abortion law, which she has promised she won't, people will go on the street, surely. But then what? It might have a popular expression, but I fear if they will have this landslide victory of 60%, that it will be difficult to change. There's been a lot of opinion polls about Italians' opinions on several aspects about immigration or abortion or citizenship, and it seems that Italians are actually have become increasingly progressive. They want it to be easier for foreigners to have citizenship. There are fewer people now in Italy that are against abortion than previously. A registered partnership from LGBTQ people are also supported by Italians. Nevertheless, electorally, when you look at the parliament and how it will be composed after the election, this will not be the majority. Apparently, it's not so important for these people that's what determine what they vote for. Perhaps it's not so important that it will determine whether they vote. I think the biggest winner at this election will be the people staying home. That's going to be the biggest party. So I agree that I'm not necessarily. I think that there is a civil society out there that cares and that engages in society, but that step from the civil society and the grassroots movements into political vision, at least for now, I haven't seen that on the center left, and I think that's one of the center right's great advantages.
What is the normal level of attendance at the Italian elections? You say that.
You mean in percentage terms?
Yeah.
In the national election is actually quite high. We'll go
Well,
up to 80.
recently,
60 or
more,
60
more.
more than that?
Or
Okay.
up to 80.
But they expect it to be lower
Yeah.
this time.
This time this was too low. Yeah.
up until recently, 40% of Italians didn't know whether to vote and who to vote for. So I'm happy if it's 70%.
If I may, just very quickly, I'm not an expert in social movements in any way. I tend to agree with both of you that the experiences we have seen recently have petered out one way or the other. If I try to look at it from the outside, one interpretation I have is that these were not from whatever angle they came from, they were never a horizontal grassroots movement, but actually relatively niche in their representation. And the way I would like to exemplify this is in two ways. One is, if you look at parties that, if these movements, let's say, protested against an presumably illiberal turn or in the future maybe a nationalist conservative turn, then if you ask the opposite question, how many liberal so-called liberal parties would you see in Italy at the moment is a very, small percentage. I mean, they would say, they would call themselves the third pole, but it doesn't really exist as a force. And again, the fact that Berlusconi now, whatever he may represent, calls himself a liberal, but he still probably fares in the low tens, not even in the, single digits, shows that we're talking about a small group. And I would recommend, that's the second example. There came yesterday an article in the New Yorker about describing, of course, the election, but also the role of some minority outlets in Italy, such as Il Post, I don't know if this rings a bell, L'Inchiesta. So these are the sort of minority, the sort of very small news media outlets that would actually air these kind of campaigns. I mean, they've been actually launching campaigns, but we're talking about really niche. So I would recommend you to read it because it frames it in a perspective. They call them the liberal elite that talks about civil rights. I think it is a problem that is an elite and a niche that talks about civil rights, that it's everybody's rights, but I'm afraid it's quite accurate, actually.
Thank you for that. And the gentleman down here.
My name is Nikolai Lunø. I'm a retired organizational psychologist. I'd be curious to know whether you could say anything about how you would expect the next Italian government to deal with the overall economic situation of Italy. And I'm asking in particular because 2 or 3 years ago, 2 Danish economists published a book where they aired a concern that the European Union might break up along a west-east border in north and south due to the fact that the trade deficit keeps going in the south and trade surplus keeps going in the north. And they also voiced different suggestions for how to deal with that problem, how to put pressure, I should say, what's that modern word? Nudge how to nudge the South. That's what you do nowadays. You don't force people, you nudge people.
Yeah. Yes.
How to nudge the South into
psychologists want to do that. Yes.
That's what we do, yes.
Yes.
This is, I think, a very good question. I also had it on my list of contingency questions to ask. How will the coalition, the right-wing coalition, stay together when there is this built-in friction between those who are centrist, nationalist, and those who are sort of centrifugist?
Yeah. Should we take the answers now? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, on this one, I am surprisingly relatively optimistic on the economic. Let's start with the economic. Some of these parties, specifically Salvini and of course even the 5 Stars, and we haven't talked about the 5 Stars much, but this is one of these protest movements, again, that come out of the blue and then now has petered out, although it has had a small resurgence lately. But they were talking in their upward phase, at least, about Italy exiting the euro, Italy even out of the EU. Let's do a referendum. None of them talks about this anymore. So there is clearly an understanding. And again, this goes back to the point, once they come to power, they realize the stakes, and the margin of maneuver all of a sudden shrinks. So what they will realize is that Italy is in the euro to stay. It's not going anywhere, because after all, it is the sort of safety net that makes something like the recovery fund possible. So, when Draghi, and we haven't talked much about Draghi either, which would deserve really a lot of session on its own, I think. I'm a big Draghi fan. He, of course, presided over a phase of growth, which was partly an upswing from the COVID, slowdown, but also because the recovery fund begins to work. So it was 6%, plus 6% last year, plus 3% this year. Am I going to say that Italy is a virtuous country now economically? No, I'm not going to say that. But if in any way this Recovery and Resilience Fund can be seen as some sort of mutualization of debt of solidarity. Italy is the biggest beneficiary. So if there is a test case for this to work, it will have to be Italy. So that's my 2 cents on this.
Just a small comment to Fabrizio's point here. It's not more than 2 weeks ago, von der Leyen gave her State of the Union speech, and what she actually said there was that we need to reconsider the Maastricht criteria and the Stability Pact. And in my opinion, I was commenting on that talk, and in my opinion, this was all about Italy. This was all about sending a signal to Italy: we understand you, we care about you. Please don't leave us. Stay here. We will make it work. Of course, there is an entire, I think, reconsideration among economists in all of Europe about, the financial crisis. The way we handled that was not very productive. We came out of the crisis much later than the United States. We simply have to reconsider how we do the criteria we have for countries to how high their debt should be and how they should reform and so on. So keep pushing on the reform agenda, but also be more complacent and maybe even introduce new kind of rules on the budget and the requirements that you need to live up to be part of the euro. So I think that is really important to understand that was also, I think, a message before the Italian election.
I agree.
Yes, I very much agree with you, but I just want to point towards the European parliamentary election in 2019, whereas in Denmark it was a victory for the pro-EU parties. It was the opposite in Italy. And during COVID, the first months of COVID, Euroscepticism increased in Italy. It wasn't until the Recovery Fund and Draghi that it all changed, and it changed very dramatically. But it has been a tendency in Italian politics to have quite a large degree of Euroscepticism. And the question is, when the money of the Recovery Fund have been paid out, when there's no more this sense of EU being a project that gives to Italy, but rather a project which Meloni already is creating a narrative around, a project that takes from Italy. What will happen with this Euroscepticism? I think that for now, the project of taking Italy out of the EU and out of the EU is entirely dead, but I'm not necessarily sure that it can't be relived, especially with general international tendencies in mind as well. And then for the question of what the coalition's economic politics is, I think it refers back to this theme that I touched upon, that there are some internal power struggles within this coalition. Berlusconi initiated the election campaign with claiming that he would guarantee every retired person in Italy €1,000. That's a month, yeah. That's probably not what the EU hopes for. And if Italy is to receive these money from the Recovery Fund, it also has the EU expects Italy to deliver on the economic side as well. And already Italian possibilities of economic possibilities is quite narrow due to all of the legislation from the Euro crisis. All of the three right-wing leaders in different aspects, they stress the urgency of a flat tax. Salvini even proposes 15%. That will be shocking for the Italian budget if they actually do it, and it's very doubtful the EU will just accept that. So there are some controversies within this urge to get the money from the Recovery Fund and be great friends with the EU, and then actually delivering on these electoral programs of the specific parties.
Thank you for that. We have two questions. We'll take both of them, and then you can answer in the very last round. We have three questions. I see two from the back seats here. Yep, please go ahead.
Yeah, then I'll keep it brief. I'll just, my name is Maria. I'm not affiliated with anything. I was just wondering about the electorate and the great success of Meloni in mobilizing, and to my understanding, a lot of young people, which surprised me a lot, that I wouldn't expect, that I know myself, and was very shocked to find supporting her. So I'm a little curious about that. Who is she mobilizing, and how have she been able to mobilize what I see as not only the classical like South that you would expect, or the people receiving the retirement check from Berlusconi that could that I in my impression is like the usual supporters of the further right. Yeah.
Thank you. And can you move a bit over there? Did you? Yep.
Hello, my name is Maria. I'm not quite sure if it's already been told, but what does the opinion poll says about how the young people in Italy are going to vote? And does any of the candidates come up with solution or any specific solution of the high employment amongst the young people?
And the gentleman here in the front. You need to have the microphone. It's coming there. Yep.
I would also go on with my name is Leif Østerholt. I would also go on with the fragmentation of Italian politics, and I would also ask about the young people and the voting among old and young people. But these questions have been asked. But then I would also like to raise the regional questions. Traditionally, the North didn't have very much respect for the South, and something was I think is strange, is that for many years I read that there was a disrespect of Rome and the Italian government. How can you, in this way, suddenly praise the nation and praise the state? I mean, that's really a change, if that's correct. The other thing is that you had the South. I think that at the last election, many voters voted for Cinque Stelle. In the South, how can they, and they had some left-oriented politics on some issues, and now they have changed and now some of them changed to the right wing. I mean, there's some very strong changes in among voters. How does all this fit? And Salvini's party goes back to Lega Nord or north of Italy, and have this very strong animosity towards the South. How does it fit?
Thank you for that. I think what I'll do is I'll leave this last question for you, for Riccio, and the two first questions, the young people, for you, Alberti. And then if you want to come in, then Malene, then go ahead. And then we can continue after we finish this break bilaterally.
I'll start out then. It was also on my list actually of things to mention, like why is Meloni all of a sudden so popular? In my opinion, she represents newness. And this perhaps is controversial because she's a former minister and her party's been in power several times. Nevertheless, she hasn't been part of the Draghi government. She's criticized it at several occasions, and while the other parties who have been in government have made compromises and have had to make compromises in order to be responsible for this government, they have also made compromises with some that are ideologically very different than themselves, and that's torn on their credibility. And this question of credibility is quite a big one in Italy. In fact, for more than 30 years, there hasn't been a government winning an election. Every single government has lost the election. So right now, Meloni is a new factor. She, it's very debatable whether it's believable that she's outside this power elite, but nevertheless, she has succeeded in describing herself as the person being the most out of this power elite. So there is this, and perhaps I'm touching upon various of these questions that that's been mentioned now. So there is within her rhetoric and within her strategy this populist strategy of depicting herself as a representative of the people that have been neglected or ignored or somewhat haven't been heard, and a criticism of the elite. And generally, when you look at the voters for this election compared to the previous election, the biggest changes are within the blocks. So it's not like that the right is all of a sudden taking a lot of votes from the left. Most of Meloni's votes comes from Lega, but some votes, that's at least how it's predicted right now. Of course, the election hasn't been yet, so we're in a guessing phase. But some votes will probably move from the five-star movement to Meloni's. And this speaks into the general strategy of a nearly post-ideological vote, of a post-ideological electorate that is not necessarily convinced by far-right or far-left ideologies or politics, but is convinced by the urgency of something new. We mentioned that a lot of people don't know whether to go vote, up to 40%. A lot of these people are the young people. So they are the ones perhaps who experience this fear that the future might not be as optimistic as it has been in previous generations, and they have no natural place to go. And just as a small anecdote, and I'll leave the word to you guys, one way to see that this election is very much about the young people's vote is to see how these politicians, who are mostly quite old, obviously Berlusconi is the oldest, he's 85, they're all on TikTok. So they know right now that politics is determined by the young generation. And as I see it, it's not a question of the left, as it's been in many other countries, as the left being the progressive side that young people support, and the right being conservative side that young people don't support. It's way more nuanced than that.
And then I'll leave it to you, Fabrizio, to lead us off in the Nordic way. As you describe it in the book, you have 3 minutes.
3 minutes. All right. No, I'll make it. I actually would like to also say a couple of words on the youth questions, and then on the north-south, and I'll probably finish off with Europe. On the youth issue, actually, thank you for raising that question, because I think some things are probably just taken for granted, but Italy is a country that both demographically and culturally has a problem, a serious problem with this structural problem. And culturally, that leads to the sort of gerontocracy that you maybe hinted at, which is not only in the politics, but also in university or in public sector, in private sector. And it is, you can say, cultural. I mean, the richest man in Italy, Leonardo Del Vecchio, is he just died, I think, more than 100 years, and he was actually running the company when he was still and so that is anecdotal, but the bottom line is that it has translated into a diffuse precariat for youth, which again, to be honest, I moved to Italy a few years ago, and it wasn't. I got too much used to the Danish, way of doing things, because it is extreme. I mean, what young people are supposed to do to get started in life, it's actually quite extreme. And about this, one last point is that a couple of weeks ago, you probably have seen Macron giving a speech, or rather an intervention to his own cabinet, to the government, and it was televised, and he said this thing that the age of abundance is over. We need to get used to this. And when I heard about that, I thought, okay, this is in Italy, that problem is squared. I mean, clearly, the age of expanding welfare state and raising pensions is for a generation that the youth knows that it doesn't apply to them. The youth know that all that is gonna be over. But there is also where a little bit the EU skepticism or a reverse of skepticism comes into it, because some of the answers to that really big problem will probably only come from Europe. But I'll get to that in the end. On the north-south regional question, again, it is more than a generational. It's a century-long issue. I'm not going to be able to answer it in a minute. Let me say just very briefly. both the book and the cover actually they refer often to the story of Italy's north and center north as being the home of the social capital of Putnam wrote about democracy based on that experience, right? And these are well-governed, usually well-governed regions. What I'm trying to say is that there is an issue with that is again has been immanent and permanent for many, many decades about social trust, and it doesn't necessarily translate into organized crime or corruption. There is also unfortunately that as well, but there is simply a distance between the citizen and the state that is in very different ways from the north and the south. If I could make a bet about what can improve something like that in the short, medium term, is actually something like large infrastructure projects in the south. And I mean, if you've been on holiday in Calabria or Sicily, you will notice simply, the trains, the streets, the moment you pass Florence, I'm from Rome, so I'm tempted to say Rome, but the moment you pass Rome and you go south, you just simply see crumbling infrastructure. And that's again where Europe comes back, because this is what the recovery fund is also about, rebuilding and green and infrastructure, also digital infrastructure. I'm not sugarcoating this. There is Euroscepticism in Italy, and my last point about this is that the sort of almost faith in Euro optimism that Italy had until 10-15 years ago, in fact until the financial crisis, is gone. I mean, every party there is an inch of skepticism or even realism. So actually, if I may say, somebody like Enrico Letta, who is technically, the opposition coalition, but we haven't even named him today because he doesn't look very strongly. He has this, I'm tempted to call it an old style Europeanism to it that sounds, even to my ears as somebody who's sympathetic, increasingly hollow. I mean, you can see that he speaks about immigration and says, well, we should resolve the problem in Europe. Yes, but this sounds hollow to people that maybe are in the provinces and the rest of it. So what I'm trying to say is that eventually, actually, there is Euroscepticism, but there is not the extreme radical urge to exit, because people realize that if some of these problems about youth, about north-south, if they will be resolved concretely, it will be with help from Brussels, and then we can discuss whether it's right or wrong. But I'm afraid that that's where I would leave it at the moment.
So on that happy note, we'll not see what is the expression for Italian exit of the EU. There must be some sort of
Italexit.
Italexit. There's not going to be an Italexit. On that happy note, we should leave it here. First of all, I would like to thank you speakers, and of course also the great people who asked questions and those who attended. I think that we have managed to do what was the intention of this event, but also of many other DIIS events, that is to increase the knowledge, the collective knowledge about some key issues in our lives. And we've been able to do that because we had some smart questions and some great interventions. And now we can follow the elections this weekend with a new level of insight. That is very, very good indeed. And we also know that you have termed yourself, Fabrizio, as a pop psychologist. That's the new thing live on. Yeah. But let's join together and thank the panelists for their interventions. Thank you very much indeed. Hope you have a nice weekend.